Claiming central space immediately, this pawn opens diagonals for rapid development. Establishing central control immediately mirrors white's intention and sets the stage for a balanced positional struggle, neither player yielding ground without a fight. Developing a knight prepares for central pawn advances, while keeping options open for various pawn structures. Developing a knight to a natural square, this prepares for central pawn breaks and castle. Challenging black's central pawn is the immediate aim, creating dynamic pawn tension and potentially opening lines for development. Solidifying the center, this choice prepares to develop the king's bishop and supports the d5 pawn, aiming for a robust pawn structure. Instantly relieving the central tension opens up lines, potentially favoring development speed. Accepting the pawn exchange solidifies black's central pawn structure, opening diagonals for future piece development. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies central control and prepares for eventual kingside castling. Developing the bishop to d6 offers improved defense for the e6 pawn and prepares for castling, while also eyeing the weakened dark squares on the kingside. Developing the bishop to a more active square, this bishop now eyes the enemy king's weakened diagonal and potentially supports future central expansion. Solidifying the pawn chain, black prepares for a central counterthrust and potential queenside expansion while keeping king's safety paramount. Unifying the queen and bishop creates a powerful battery, eyeing the king's flank and preparing to exploit the weakened kingside dark squares. Securing the monarch initiates a crucial defensive maneuver, solidifying the kingside before any potential skirmishes erupt. Solidifying the center and preparing kingside castling, this maneuver subtly prepares for future central pawn advances while keeping the king safe. Preparing to activate the rook on the open e-file offers central influence and potential for a future pawn push. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal allows it to eye black's kingside, potentially setting up future pressure. Challenging the pinned bishop, black immediately seeks to disrupt white's harmony and potentially open lines. Retreating the bishop concedes the initiative, allowing black to develop freely. Re-establishing the bishop's influence, this repositions a key defender, aiming to solidify the queenside and prepare for counterplay. This repositioning of the knight to e5 aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances. Unleashing central pressure, this pawn thrust ignites a dynamic struggle, aiming to disrupt white's comfortable setup and open new avenues for black's pieces. Securing the monarch in the safe harbor of the kingside prepares for potential central advances or pawn storm aggression. Capturing the pawn opens the c-file, offering active piece play and disrupting white's pawn structure. Opening the e-file immediately pressures black's queenside pawns. Developing the knight to c6 aims to regain central influence and prepare potential pawn pushes. Exchanging knights opens the d-file, potentially leading to increased pawn pressure and a clearer path for white's rooks. Opening the b-file creates long-term play for your rook, but weakens your pawn structure. Unlocking the queenside's potential, by repositioning the bishop aims to support a future queenside pawn push. Trading the active bishop liberates the a8h1 diagonal for your rook, and potentially weakens white's pawn structure by creating doubled pawns on the c-file. Opening the h-file for rook activity drastically alters the pawn structure. White must now actively utilize this for compensation. The knight boldly ventures into enemy territory, threatening the g-file and potentially creating attacking chances. Repositioning the queen to d2 offers flexibility, ready to challenge the e-pawn or support an eventual kingside attack. A strategic redirection, the rook targets the open b-file, aiming to create pressure along that flank while white's king remains somewhat exposed. Preparing to shore up queenside space and potentially launch a pawn storm, this maneuver subtly repositions forces toward the flank. Unleashing the queen creates immediate pressure on the kingside and eyes the e3 pawn, seeking to exploit white's slightly exposed monarch. Shifting the queen to the f-file initiates a playful dance, aiming to disrupt black's developing harmony and pry open a path towards the king. Trading queens simplifies into a king's pawn endgame, where the doubled pawns on the c-file could become a weakness. Transforming the kingside pawn structure fundamentally alters the endgame's character, creating immediate structural weaknesses. Probing for weaknesses, this rook ventures forward, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns and control the open file. Now commanding the central open file, white prepares to pressure black's isolated d-pawn and restrict the bishop's scope. Shifting, the king proactively clears a path for the rooks and prepares for potential pawn advances, a sensible precaution in this imbalanced position. Reclaiming development, the bishop anchors a vital central defense, preparing for potential pawn advances. Reclaiming the central dark squares is a priority, but this knight's sortie might be a bit premature given the pawn structure. Reinforcing the central c-file for potential pressure, Rack 1 stabilizes white's presence and prepares for future pawn advances. Reactivating the bishop to the queen side offers a chance to contest the open b-file and pressure white's pawns. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure aims to solidify white's defenses and potentially prepare for pawn advances later, albeit at the cost of some pawn flexibility. Unlocking the king's file requires knight repositioning. Repositioning to bolster the king's safety and prepare for central pawn advances. Probing the queen side, this pawn advance aims to gain space and potentially open lines for black's pieces. Unleashing a pawn storm, white seeks to gain queenside space and potentially trap black's knight. Reclaiming the knight's outpost offers a subtle positional advantage, preparing for future queenside expansion. Centralizing the knight offers attacking potential and strengthens the pawn majority. Unleashing a pawn storm here, black seeks to disrupt white's defensive structure and open lines toward the king. Unleashing a pawn storm to dislodge the knight, aiming to seize the now weakened kingside for an assault. Seeking respite from white's growing pawn wall, the knight awkwardly retreats, abandoning the queenside and the central initiative. Asserting control over the queenside with the knight aims to restrict black's rook and disrupt their pawn structure. Repositioning the knight to e7 aims to unblock the f-pawn and potentially challenge white's kingside pawn advances. Asserting central control and potentially exploiting weaknesses, this knight advances to a commanding square. Re-establishing piece contact on the queenside aims to contest the open c-file and find active squares for the bishop. Asserting control of the queenside pawn structure with this advance aims to restrict black's pieces from penetrating. Seeking to undermine white's pawn structure by activating the rook on the open file, but a premature commitment before supporting the knight. Repositioning the bishop to an active diagonal can unlock attacking potential and restrict black's knight. Seeking activity, the knight jumps, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially attack the f3 pawn. Simplifying the pawn structure to target the open files and potentially create a passed pawn on the kingside. Recapturing the bishop opens up a vital diagonal for black's queen and creates immediate pressure on white's queenside pawns. The king embarks on a journey to a safer square, seeking to escape potential queenside pressure. Unleashing a pawn thrust can create dynamism, but it potentially exposes your own king to the adversary's advancing pieces. Initiating a daring rook lift to menace the kingside pawn structure. A bold gambit of space for a potential passed pawn, but it leaves the king perilously exposed. Bringing the rook into the fight reclaims central influence and prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside. Challenging the kingside pawns aggressively, this pawn break aims to pry open lines for the bishop and create immediate threats. Pawns advance with a predatory gaze, seeking to imprison black's active pieces. Releasing the pinned rook on e1 allows the king to finally breathe, opening lines for potential counterplay. The rook repositions to dominate the open file, aiming to create future breakthroughs. Opening a pathway for the rooks to penetrate the king's weakened defenses. Activating the king is essential to navigate this complex pawn structure. reclaiming the bishop with 39. Bxg6 decisively activates that piece and begins to contest the initiative on the queen side. Sacrificing material to expose the enemy king is a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. The bishop's check immediately exploits the weakened light squares around the king, forcing white's monarch into a precarious position. Recapturing the bishop with the king offers immediate counterplay and avoids pawn structure weaknesses. Opening the rook file offers a potential pathway for your monarch to join the fray. Repositioning the rook to the second rank solidifies control of that important pathway. Mobilizing the king towards the center offers greater activity and defensive options in the impending endgame. Reactivating the king's central role is paramount to orchestrating a cohesive defense. Reasserting the bishop's influence on the light squares offers crucial defensive support and potential regrouping for the queen side. Centering the king provides crucial support for potential pawn advances and consolidates defensively. Activating the rook on the open file creates immediate tension against white's isolated passed pawn. Initiating a king hunt, seeking to exploit the open lines and potential weakness on the queen side. Sensing an opportunity, the rook mobilizes to a more active file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Controlling the center with this rook shuffle reestablishes white's influence and prepares for further pawn advances. Shifting the rook to the open file offers potential support for the pawn advance and unifies the pieces. Controlling the open b-file secures a vital pathway for your rook, allowing it to exert pressure on black's queen side. Securing the rook on the 7th rank offers valuable defensive cover and prepares a potential advance up the file. Advancing this pawn restricts black's rook from accessing the file, a key strategic objective. The rook anchors itself on the 7th rank, preparing to infiltrate the white king's defenses. Seizing the open file, white prepares to pressure black's vulnerable king. The rook finally finds a more active position, potentially supporting a pawn push or assisting the king's eventual journey. Asserting open file dominance, the rook seeks to penetrate black's weakened kingside. The bishop vacates the g6 square, potentially preparing for a pawn push or to redeploy to a more active diagonal. Opening the e-file allows your rook to become active, aiming to penetrate black's defenses and harass the king. The king seeks refuge on the queen side, preparing to support the central pawn push. A judicious repositioning of the monarch, seeking refuge on the queen side while avoiding potential checks. The king's journey to the queen side is now a primary objective, seeking safety and potential counterplay. Opening the b-file presents a new avenue for attack and potential piece activity. Sacrificing the pawn to open the file now creates immediate pressure on white's queen side. Securing the crucial kingside pawn provides a vital outpost and initiates a race to promote. Gaining a central pawn advance provides crucial breathing room and opens avenues for the rook. Unleashing the rook creates immediate pressure on the file, threatening to pry open further lines for attack.